Hello and welcome back to Something Z, and welcome to If Deku Had Venom Part 4. Last time on the What If, the UA Sports Festival took place, and during the festival, Zuko and Venom were able to make it through the event until they fought against Todoroki after Zuko gave Todoroki therapy mid-fight, making him use his fire side. Then afterwards, the internships took place with Zuko and Ochako going to Gunhead for the internships, which allowed Zuko to hone in on his fighting abilities, giving him the ability to manipulate the symbiote more than he could before. But sadly, during the internships, the attack at Hosu happened, and because of that, Ito was killed when he tried to fight Stan on his own. Okay, so now that's out of the way, let's jump into the video in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so to begin this with, the day it was announced that Ida had died by the hero killer, and Izuku and Ochaku just got the news about his death. And when they learned about it, they were upset, and they felt like they should have done more. And after grieving for a couple hours, they went back to training, because they want to become even stronger than they were now, because they don't want this to happen again. Okay, so now we skip a couple weeks, so now it's time for the final exams. And by this point, Izuku has gotten even better at controlling the symbiote, so he can control his tendrils with more efficiency, and he can make his weapons. And he can now hold both for 10 minutes straight without losing stamina. Okay, so now we skip to the final exams, and the score everyone got for the written exams will be the exact same as in the canon, for both the practice and the actual written exam. So it's time for the students versus teachers test, but more specifically, the match between Bakugo, Izuku, and All Might. And when it began, a siren rang out throughout the entire fake city. And hearing the siren, Izuku covered himself in venom. And once Izuku was covered, the two began to fly towards the exit, with Izuku swinging and Bakugo firing explosions behind him. But after a couple minutes of this, Izuku began to feel his senses going off. And feeling this, Izuku shouted for Bakugo to stop. But before he could finish his sentence, a powerful gust of air hit the two, and the blast was strong enough to launch them both back to the entrance of the city. And the air was so strong that it was able to destroy buildings, and pieces of the road got flung in different directions. Then once the two were able to see, they saw All Might standing at the other side of the city. Then once Bakugo saw All Might, he propelled himself towards him, and he began to try to fight him, with little success thanks to All Might's strength and durability, even with the handicaps. And eventually, Bakugo goes in for a punch, using an explosion to add for speed. But before he was able to land the punch, All Might ducked and he was able to grab Bakugo's leg. Then once he had a hold of Bakugo, he slammed him into the ground. And by the time Bakugo hit the ground, Izuku was finally able to recover from him being launched, so he was able to see correctly. And when he saw Bakugo on the ground, Izuku ran towards the two as fast as he could. And while he was running, Izuku sprouted out two tendrils from his back. And once he got the two, Izuku launched his tendrils. And once the two were formed, Izuku launched his tendrils, and he tried to grab a hold of All Might's arms. And once All Might's arms were grabbed, Izuku punched All Might as hard as he could in the gut, which did seem to have some effect, but All Might was able to tank it easily. Then once Izuku landed the punch, All Might was able to easily break through the restraints, with him tearing off the symbiote tendrils straight off of Izuku. And once they were detached, they let go, and they began to slither toward Izuku. And once they got to Izuku, Izuku absorbed them back into the symbiote. Then once they were absorbed back into Izuku, Izuku and All Might began to fight, with Izuku using his super speed and sense, allowing him to dodge All Might's attacks just in time. But after around 30 seconds, All Might was able to grab Izuku by the arm, and he began to spin around at high speeds. Then after a couple cycles, he stopped, and he threw Izuku, making him go flying towards a building multiple stories up. Then after a couple seconds, Izuku smashed through the office building window, making him go crashing into the furniture in the room. And when Izuku got back, he wiped some of the dirt and glass off of him. And when he was done, he jumped out of the already broken window. And when he was in the air, he saw that Bakugo was able to regain his consciousness, and he was back to fighting All Might. And seeing this, Izuku shot out two webs from his hands, which landed on the right and left side of All Might. And with his increased speed plus strength, he was able to topple All Might, making him land to the ground. Then once All Might was on the ground, Izuku quickly shot out 4 tendrils from his body. Then once they were formed, Izuku began to flail them wildly at the ground, kicking up dirt. And because of that, he began to create a dirt cloud, and after a couple seconds, there was a 5-foot area where no one could see. And when Izuku believed that it was enough, Izuku shot out a web from where he last saw Bakugo, and he flew towards that direction. And while he was in midair, he collided with Bakugo. So feeling this, Izuku grabbed Bakugo, and he ran the two of them into a nearby alleyway. And by the time the dirt fell, making it visible for All Might, the two were already hidden. And upon seeing this, All Might began to run around trying to find the two. And once the two saw this, Izuku tried to come up with a plan to get to the exit without fighting All Might. But with Bakugo wanting to lose more than to work with Izuku, it was a bit difficult. But after a couple minutes of Izuku trying to convince Bakugo, he was finally able to make Bakugo reluctantly work with him. So the two began to try to think of a plan that would allow them to get to the exit. And after around a few minutes of planning, they were able to come up with a plan. So Bakugo then gave Izuku one of his gauntlets, and they both waited in separate alleyways. And when Izuku put on the gauntlet, he retracted the venom that was on his arm, that was covered by the gauntlet, to make sure that Venom wouldn't get hit by it. And eventually, All Might sped to the two students' alleyways. But before he could pass the two alleys, the two jumped out. And when they landed, Izuku was standing in front of All Might while Bakugo was behind him. And seeing this, All Might stopped for a second. And when he pulled back for a second, the two pulled the pins that were on the respective gauntlets, which surrounded All Might in a giant explosion. And when the explosion got fired, All Might was dazed. And with him like that, Izuku and Bakugo sped towards the exit as fast as they could, with Izuku swinging on his webs while Bakugo flew using his explosions. But before they were able to get to the exit, All Might was able to regain his senses, so he ran at the two as fast as he could, catching up to the two in a few seconds, with him appearing right next to Izuku. And once he was in the air next to Izuku, he grabbed Izuku by the head and he slammed him into the ground. Then once Izuku was on the ground, All Might smashed the gauntlet that was on Izuku's arm. Then once it was destroyed, Izuku quickly got to his feet and he tried to punch All Might. But in response, All Might grabbed Izuku by the fist, and he threw him into another building multiple stories up. Then once Izuku landed, All Might appeared next to Bakugo, and he grabbed Bakugo by his legs and he flung him into the same building he put Izuku in. And when he landed, Bakugo saw Izuku was on the ground in pain. And when they both got up, they jumped out of the building using their quirks to cushion their fall. And when they landed, All Might was waiting for them, so Izuku then ran at All Might and he began to fight him again, mainly focusing on dodging and getting quick attacks off. And while Izuku was keeping All Might distracted, he shouted for Bakugo to run, which at first Bakugo was hesitant to, but he changed his mind when Izuku shouted for him to run again. And when All Might saw Bakugo run, he tried to run after him. But when he tried to take a step, Izuku sprouted out more tendrils, and he began to wrap them around All Might's limbs, holding him back. Which did work for a couple seconds, but seeing that Izuku was holding him back, All Might then turned and he ran towards Izuku and he punched Izuku in the gut, launching him. But while Izuku was flying, and before All Might could start running, Izuku shot out a web, which hit All Might's back. And when it hit, Izuku retracted and pulled on the web, flinging him directly back at All Might, and he kicked him, launching All Might a couple feet. And seeing this, All Might knew that Izuku wouldn't leave him alone if he left him standing. So he then ran at Izuku at full speed and he punched Izuku in the gut again. But because this time Izuku was unable to react in time, he goes flying into a building. Then after Izuku got hit into the building, All Might ran to Bakugo as fast as he could. But because of his weights he was wearing, and because Bakugo was already too close to the exit, he wasn't able to make it in time. And when Bakugo was able to make it through the exit, an alarm rang out through the entire fake city, announcing that Izuku and Bakugo have passed the exam. Okay, so now I skip to the next day, and Class 1A was told that even if they fail the exam, they will still be going to the summer camp. And when class was over, Class 1A decided that they should go on a shopping trip to get all the supplies they need. And after a couple minutes after getting to the mall, Izuku was all by himself since everyone else wanted to split up to buy the things that they wanted. But before he was able to make it to a store, someone in a hoodie put their arm around Izuku, and he told him it's been a while since he's last seen him, because the last time they met was at the USJ. And hearing this, Izuku began to recognize the man. It was the guy in the hand mask. And seeing this, Izuku began to move to try to take him out. But before he could move, Shigaraki told Izuku to stop, and that he had his portal friend on standby with an army of Nomus prepared, and that if he moves in a way that he doesn't like, he will make his friend warp the army of Nomus into the plaza. He then asked Izuku how many people would have to die because of him, and because Izuku doesn't know if it's a bluff or not, he goes along with it, and he tried to put his arms down. But when he did, he saw that Venom wouldn't allow that, and that he still wanted to fight. And when Izuku realized this, Venom asked why didn't he fight back? Why didn't Izuku just take him down? And that even if they did summon the army of Nomus, they would be able to survive and escape thanks to their powers. But hearing this, Izuku told Venom no, because just because they could survive, that doesn't mean that's the right move, and that as a hero, they both have to care about other people's lives ahead of their own. And hearing this, Venom began to ponder, allowing Izuku to take control. And once Izuku got control of his arms back, he put down his arms. And seeing this, Shigaraki led Izuku to a bench and they began to talk. And when they were done talking, Shigaraki came to the conclusion that All Might was at the center of all of his problems. And when he figured this out, he began to thank Izuku. But before he could finish, Ochako showed up. And seeing this, Shigaraki said his final thank you. Then he walked into the crowd of civilians. And after a couple seconds, Shigaraki was lost in the crowd. So now we skip a couple hours and the mall has been shut down, and Izuku is taken to the police department for questioning. Okay, so now we skip to when the summer trip begins. And after a couple hours on a bus, Class 1A stops at a mountain. And when they all got out of the bus, the class met the WWPC, who welcomed them to the camp. Then Pixie Bob pointed in the direction of the camp. And before they could question why she pointed to the camp, Pixie Bob began to manipulate the ground around them, and eventually she flung all of Class 1A off the cliff. And when they landed, they were told to get to the camp as quick as they could. And after they were told to get to the camp, they began to reluctantly walk. But after a couple minutes of walking, monsters made out of dirt and stone began to appear out of the shadows of the trees. And seeing this, Izuku covered himself in venom, and he turned his hands into blades. Then once Izuku was prepared, he ran at the monsters and he began to slap them down, fighting the monsters alongside the rest of the class. Okay, so now we skip to when the sun was setting, and Class 1A just got to the campgrounds. And because they had to deal with monsters all the way from the cliff to the camp, they were all tired and dirty, Izuku included, with him being in his normal form because Venom got tired as well. Okay, so now we skip to the next morning, and by the time the sun rose, the training for Class 1A began. And everything that happened the previous night still happens, along with the things with Koda, so Izuku knows about Koda's parents. And when Izuku spent around half the time doing for the first day was fighting Tiger, being forced to have his tendrils out of his body, even while he was at his time limit. So Izuku can get better at controlling them for longer periods of time. and so Izuku would get more stamina training, along with normal training in general by fighting Tiger. Then the other half of the time was spent with Izuku swinging from the trees around the camp, with Aizawa timing him. And he had to keep doing it with as little time for break as possible. And this would allow Izuku to get even better at swinging and using his webbing for mobility, if he wasn't in a city. Plus it would make Izuku's amount of webbing and the webbing itself stronger. And when they were done training for the day, Class 1A and 1B had to make dinner. And when they were done and while Izuku was having dinner, he knows that Koda wasn't there. So he got a plate of food and began to swing around, making sure that the food wouldn't fall. And after a couple minutes, Izuku found Koda on a cliff looking at the stars. And when Izuku got close, he landed as close as he could and he began to walk towards Koda. And while he was walking, he put away Venom. And when Izuku got to Koda, the two began to talk, with Koda asking why does Izuku want to be a hero so much? And Koda tells Izuku that he's just throwing his life away. And after a couple minutes, Izuku put down the plate of food and he coated himself in Venom. Then once he was coated, Izuku jumped into the forest and he began to swing back to the camp. Okay, so now we skip to the next day, and the training Izuku did was different, because he did do the same fighting training with Tiger, but instead of swinging around, Izuku instead turned his hands into blades, and from a singular spot miles away from the rest of the camp, he had to turn the area he was standing in into a desolate piece of land by shooting out his tendrils at the end of them, but at the end of them he had to form blades and spears. And he had to keep up the blades as long as he could, making Izuku get better at both stretching out his tendrils, increasing the strength of his tendrils and the lengths he could make them, and manipulating the density of the symbiote with the blades. And this kept going on for the rest of the day, and with that, Izuku was able to increase his time limit to 20 minutes for both his tendrils and weaponry. And once the day was done, the WWPC decided that the two classes deserved a prize. So they decided to hold a test of courage, with all the groups being the exact same, with Izuku being alone. But before he could go in, he and the other people outside the forest could see that the forest was covered in blue flames. Then the two villains started to walk out of the forest, and they began to fight Pixie Bop, Mandalay, and Tiger, while the students started to run to find a place to hide. But before Izuku could do anything, he remembered that Koda was most likely at the cliff. So he told Mandalay where he was going, and once she heard this, she gave Izuku a nod. And seeing this, Izuku covered himself in Venom, and he began to swing through the trees to get to the cliff as fast as possible. And after a couple minutes, he was able to get to the cliff. But he was still in the trees while the cliff was around 10 feet above him. But from where Izuku saw that Koda was talking to a villain, and the villain was beginning to walk towards Koda. But before he was able to get to Koda, Izuku shot out two webs on both sides of Muscular. And when they stuck to the side of the cliff, Izuku retracted the webbing, launching him towards the villain. And before the villain was able to react, Izuku was able to kick Muscular in the side, launching him a couple feet. And when Izuku made contact, Izuku let go of the webs, and he landed on the ground. But to Izuku's surprise, Muscular was able to tank the attack. And in fact, he asked if that was all he could do. And hearing this, Izuku shot out two tendrils and he shot them at Muscular. But before he was able to wrap up Muscular added more muscles to his body, increasing his strength. Then before Izuku was able to get out of the way, Muscular jumped using the side of the mountain to propel himself towards Izuku. And when he got to Izuku, he punched him in the gut, launching Izuku off the cliff, and he began to fall. But before Izuku got too far, Izuku shot out a web which stuck to Muscular's chest. And when it stuck, Izuku launched himself towards Muscular again. But while Izuku was right in front of Muscular swatted Izuku away, making Izuku get flung a couple feet, with him landing right in front of Koda. Then once Izuku got back up, Izuku shouted for Koda to run while he holds Muscular back. But before Koda could do anything, the villain began to walk towards the two. And while he was walking, he told Izuku that he was on the list. And he asked if he knew a person by the name of Bakugo, and where he was. But before Izuku could say anything, Muscular ran at Izuku. But luckily, this time he was able to, with his senses, duck under the punch, and he was able to punch Muscular in the gut with all he had, making Muscular get flung feet back, into the mountainside, creating a bit of a crater. Then while Muscular was getting out of the crater, Izuku shouted for Koda to run again, and that he will catch up later. And hearing this, Koda began to run with tears in his eyes. Then once Koda was at the bottom of the cliff and in the woods, Muscular was able to get to Izuku again. But this time, he increased the amount of muscles that were on his body, increasing his strength even more. And even with this, Izuku was able to sense it. And even with Izuku being able to sense it, Izuku had a hard time moving his body enough to dodge. So after a couple minutes of fighting, Izuku was tired and beaten up. And Venom was doing his best to heal Izuku while Izuku was fighting. So it was basically raw strength against speed, because no matter how hard Izuku tried to hit Muscular with any of his attacks, nothing would happen. And Izuku was just fast enough to avoid most of Muscular's attacks. But after a couple minutes, Muscular was able to grab Izuku by the ankle, and he slammed him into the ground. And once Izuku was on the ground, Muscular began to pin Izuku down, and using his strength, he began to crush Izuku, with him beginning to suffocate. And with this, Izuku knew what to do, so he told Venom to take control. Then once Izuku gave control, everything began to go into a haze for Izuku. Meanwhile, on the outside, Izuku's eyes became more spikier, and a giant mouth with many fangs opened from Izuku's mask. And the emblem on Izuku began to get even bigger, covering most of his main body. But more importantly, Izuku's muscles and body began to grow, increasing his strength. And Izuku's fingers became more like claws. Then once Venom was done changing, Venom using all of his strength shot out 6 tendrils from his back, and he shot them at Muscular, stopping his attack, and launching him into the air. Then once Venom got a hold of Muscular, he began swinging him around as fast as he could, and before Muscular was able to tear through the sturdier tendrils, Venom slammed Muscular into the mountainside, creating a crater, launching dirt into the air and creating a dirt cloud. Then after a couple seconds, Muscular got back up and he began to get his bearings. But before he was able to stop saying double, Venom ran straight towards him and he began to pound on him, launching a barrage of punches, launching Muscular deeper and deeper into the mountain. And with Muscular beginning to get beat up, he tried to increase his muscle mass. But when Venom saw this, he began to slot the muscles that were being created, making Muscular begin to waste energy, get hurt from Venom literally tearing away at his muscles, and getting weaker because Venom is starting to tear the muscles around him, because the more muscles that Venom tore, the weaker he became. Then Venom shot out a tendril and he used it to wrap around Muscular's neck, and he began to lose air, with Muscular beginning to pass out. It was Muscular not being able to power Venom, he was only able to flail for his life. But eventually, Muscular passed out from the lack of oxygen, and because he almost killed Izuku, Venom kept going and he began to kill him. But before he could completely go through with it, Izuku was able to wake up from the haze just in time, making him go back to normal. And same when Venom was done, Izuku quickly let go, making the tendril go back into him. Then he went over to Muscular and checked his pulse to see if he was still alive, and he was able to feel a pulse, but it was just very weak. And shortly after Izuku looked at the forest, he saw that the forest was still on fire, and he saw that he still needed the help. So he then jumped into the forest and he began to swing back to camp. But while he was swinging, he was lecturing Venom about what had just happened, and how he could have almost killed someone, and that he needs to hold back to some extent. And the condition of Izuku's body is mostly fine, thanks to Venom healing him constantly for the entire fight. But after some time, he came across Aizawa, who when he saw Izuku told him to give Mandalay a message. Then once Izuku got the message, Izuku asked if he had seen Koda, and hearing this, Aizawa told him that on his way he saw the kid running, and when he stopped him, Koda told him that Izuku was fighting a villain. Then once Aizawa knew where Izuku was, he told Koda where some students were hiding, so he should be fine. Then once Izuku knew that Koda was safe, Izuku began to swing back to camp even faster than before. And when he got back to camp, Mandalay and Tiger were still fighting the villains. So Izuku kicked Spinner while he was swinging, launching Spinner feet away into a tree. And while Spinner was trying to get up, Izuku ran to Mandalay and he told her the message that Aizawa gave him. And when he finished giving the message, Mandalay sent out the message to all the students, which was Aizawa gave them permission to fight. And after Mandalay sent out the message, Izuku began to run into the woods to find Bakugo. So Izuku then jumped into the woods and he began to swing through the forest to try to find Bakugo. But after a couple minutes, something jumped into the air and it pushes Izuku to the ground. And when he looked at what was on top of him, he saw Shoji, who was all bloody. And when he saw Shoji, he asked him what had happened to him. And in response, Shoji pointed to a nearby tree. And when Izuku looked at it, it seemed just like a normal tree, so he was just about to ask him what was he pointing at. But before he could finish his sentence, a giant dark hand slashes at it, cutting it in half. Shoji then explained that Tokoyami lost control over Dark Shadow. And seeing this, Izuku and Shoji began to run, trying to figure out a plan while avoiding Dark Shadow's attacks. And after a couple minutes of running, the two were able to come up with a plan, so they began to run to find Bakugo and Todoroki. And while they were running, they were using Shoji's limbs as bait so that Dark Shadow would keep following them. And after a couple minutes, they were able to find Todoroki and Bakugo, who were fighting the villain Moonfish. And when they got to the pair, Shoji and Izuku jumped over Moonfish. And before he was able to get out of the way, Dark Shadow ran into him and he slammed him into a tree, which when Moonfish made contact got knocked out. Then Izuku tells Bakugo and Todoroki to fire their flames at Tokoyami. And after a couple minutes, the two were able to weaken Dark Shadow enough so Tokoyami was able to gain control again. And after they calmed down Tokoyami, the group began to think of a plan to get back to camp. And after a couple minutes, they decided to have Tokoyami and Bakugo in the back, while the other three were in front of them, so Bakugo wouldn't get picked off. But after a couple minutes of walking, Izuku began to feel a tingling sensation across his body, making his senses go off. But before Izuku was able to tell what was going on, Izuku got trapped in a marble along with Bakugo and Tokoyami. And after a couple minutes, the remaining members of the group came across Sue stuck to a tree and Ochako on the ground getting her blood drained by a villain. And seeing the two of them, the villain got off of Ochako and she ran deeper into the forest. And when they got the two on their feet, they told them that they were bringing Bakugo back to camp. But when they told the two this, the two pointed out that Bakugo wasn't behind them. And when the two turned around, they saw that over half of the group was gone. And when they saw that, they began to look around. And after a couple minutes, when Todoroki looked up and paid attention, he realized that there was someone standing on the tree above them. And when the person realized that they saw him, he introduced himself as Mr. Compress. And when he was done with his introduction, he showed 3 marbles in his hands. And when Todoroki looked close enough, he saw that it was the 3 people in the group that were missing. And seeing this, Todoroki shot out a wave of flame, which the villain was able to dodge with ease. Then the villain began to jump away on top of the trees. And seeing this, the group began to run after him. But after a few minutes of running, they began to lose him. So Todoroki began to think of a plan, which was around the same as in the canon, with Shoji and him becoming weightless, and they used Sue to fling them at the villain. And when they were close enough, Ochako gave them weight again. And after around 30 seconds, the two made impact with the villain, making them go straight towards the ground, landing on him. And when they looked around after they landed, the two find themselves at the rendezvous point for the villains. So there's a giant portal and a couple of villains standing right next to it. But before they could do anything, Mr. Compressed threw the marbles and he turned himself into a marble. Then when he was a couple feet away, he turned himself back to normal. Then the two groups began to fight, and after a bit of time, Mr. Compressed shows the marbles in his mouth. But when he revealed the marbles, a laser beam came out of nowhere and it hit him straight in the face, making him drop the marbles. And seeing this, Shoji and Todoroki ran to grab the 3 marbles, with Shoji being able to grab the 1 marble that was in the air in front of him. But when Todoroki went to grab his 2, he wasn't able to grab them in time before Dabi was able to grab them. And shortly after Dabi was able to get his 2 marbles, the villains leave through a portal. But before they left, Mr. Compressed undid the marble Shoji had, which contained Tokoyami. Then hours later, ambulances arrived to take the injured people to the hospital, and the cops arrived to take the beaten villains to jail. And that's normally the What If. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you next time on Something Z.